will try to speak, well, you know, each of us in his or her own way tried to explain the situation in the Russian-American relations and the policies of each country to each other from the vantage point of their own area of expertise. And from a historical point of view, from a historian's point of view, I have my own take, which is probably a bit different from what we discussed before. And you know, I will start with reminding everybody that this wave of the Russia craze in the United States since the Trump election surprised not only Kremlin, but the most of Russians, including the liberal Russians or anti-Putin Russians, and still seems very overblown. I will not want to discuss the essence of this revelation of the scandals or publications in the United States about the Russian interference, Russian hackers, and Trump administration's connections with Russia. I'm just, as a historian, I can put it in a longer historical context. And the longer historical context says that every time when the United States got so disturbed by Russia or so so much interested in Russia and discussing Russia, it was more about the United States than about Russian-American relations or about anything that Russia used to do. I will, I will ask you to join me for a very brief trip into the history of Russian-American relations. I hope you understand what I mean. The very first story when the United States, when American society really discussed what Russia, was Russia a good country or bad country, was Russia civilized or uncivilized, happened more than 2 centuries ago in 1813. It was during the War of 1812. Both countries had their own wars of 1812. Russia fought against Napoleon. The United States fought against England. So technically we were on this different side, on the different side, but we had just recently established diplomatic relations, and the relations between two countries were normal, let's say. But the countries were very far from each other. No interest actually collided at that time. Nothing to share, nothing to fight for. No bone of contention between two countries ever at that time existed. And what happened in 1813? The part of American society which was opposing the very war against Britain, mostly the Federalist Party, the merchants of the Northeast, from Boston and even New York City, they suffered a lot from the war, and they needed to demonstrate their resistance to the government, administration of President Madison conduct of the foreign policy. And they could not do it by celebrating Great Britain. Of course, it was during the war; it would be very unpatriotic. So they decided to celebrate Russian victories, and they organized several huge dinners, first in Boston, then in Georgetown, with like several hundred, 500 participants and the elite of the Federalist and northeastern part of the United States. And they celebrated Russian victories in order to show President Madison that their dissatisfaction on their behavior on the war. And immediately after that, even before, when the plans were announced for these dinners, the American mass media of that time, American politicians, American journalists, and different newspapers started a clash about Russia. Was Russia a good country and Americans would be able to celebrate it? Or Russia was a bad country and the celebration of Russian victories over France or Napoleon would be a bad thing to do? And that was the first ever American discussion about the Russian qualities. Was Russia good or bad? And it was not about Russia, it was about American split, American political split. And since that time, we had several, just very briefly, I mentioned 2 other instances from the past, but believe me, it's much more often happens in the past. The second interesting period was 1870s. 1870s, again, Americans do remember, it was the end of the reconstruction of the South and the period of the huge crisis of American identity. The reconstruction of the South ended with a return of segregation or establishing the Jim Crowism in the southern state, return of the white elites to the power in the South, and many people ask the question why we fought for, what the civil war, what's the result of the civil war when the hundreds of thousands people died, if we had this end of this type of the end of Reconstruction. So it was a huge crisis, which coincided with President Grant administration, who was very unpopular as a president because he was it was a very corrupt administration, and everybody knew that. So, and that was exactly the time when Americans invented Russia as a country, which was even worse. You know, that was since that time it was a repeating a mode of speaking about Russia in the United States, that we have somebody who is even worse. And Russia is, you know, in Russia there is Siberia. It was exactly the time when George Kennan the Elder published his book Siberia and, you know, exile and Siberian exile system. And it was a time when Russia was portrayed for the first time in very black tones. Exactly, actually, by the time part of those people who portrayed Russia in such way were the descendants, literally sons and daughters of leading abolitionists, and they described Russia as the same language the parents described the South before the Civil War. So it was Russia was a country suffering, whereas the good people suffering from the pressure of the bad government, exactly the same way that African Americans suffered in the South before the revolution. That was a portrayal. But again, this was not about Russia. I mean, those Americans has nothing to do. They never traveled to Russia. They never had any relations as a commercial or cultural to Russia. They actually needed to re-establish American self-confidence, and they used Russia to say that we are better, we are. And that's exactly the same thing happened a century later, in 1970s. You know why the detente was abandoned by President Carter administration? And also it was strange. You cannot explain it by strategic point of view, because the detente was a real win-win situation. I mean, both Soviet Union and the United States won because of the series of mutual, you know, treaties of re-establishment of trust to each other. And then President Carter came and stopped all of that. Well before the Afghanistan. Afghanistan happened only in December 1979, but well before the detente was buried. And what happened and why it was so? Exactly because the United States was in a deep crisis after Watergate, after Vietnam War, and after the economic crisis of the middle of the 70s. And that was the time when American presidents had, first Jimmy Carter and then President Reagan, of course, major goal was to re-establish American trust, American self-confidence. And to do that, okay, Carter and his advisors probably look around and what was the, well, what was the only positive story about the United States in the middle of the 70s? What Americans could be proud of? They could not be proud of the political system after Watergate. They could not be proud of the mighty military after the Vietnam War. They could not be proud of the economic strength after this economic collapse. And the only thing which Americans were, you know, happy about was the results of the civil rights movements. And by the middle of the 70s, the civil rights movement in the South achieved a significant success. And that's why the agenda of civil rights was projected into the foreign policy, into Russian, Soviet American or American Soviet relations. And that was a human rights, appearance of the human rights discourse in the American policy towards the Soviet Union. And that was Carter's agenda. Again, not so much. Of course, it included the real trouble for the human rights for dissidents in Russia. But from the point of view of American society, it was mostly to say that we are still better than our major competitor, adversary, and that was. So all of those, you know, and one last like kind of joke or anecdotal story about the Mitt Romney, who you remember all in 2012 told that Russia was a traditional geopolitical force, something like that. In 2012, it was not about Russia. It was about Barack Obama, of course, because Barack Obama's first term, one of the few results that, of the first term of Barack Obama was the reset policy towards Russia. Barack Obama re-established relatively good relations with Russia by 2012. So Mitt Romney criticized not Russia when he said that Russia was a geopolitical force. He criticizes Barack Obama and his policy. And that's how it works in American society. So again, if you look from this, century of Russian-American relations and to what happens in Russia, in the United States during the last year, it's actually an attempt of American society to cope with the deep crisis of the Trump election. A deep crisis which was, spread through American society with trying to explain to themselves, to yourselves, guys, why Trump is president. And this is usual method of solving this internal crisis. Look at Russia. Trump is un-American. Trump is probably Russia, and this is something which which helps. Which is all the rhetoric is ready. All the rhetoric was accumulated for the centuries. So Russia is always something you can use to solve the internal home domestic problems. Okay, I'm afraid that. Do I have more time?
Yeah, you can take another minute or so.
Oh, another minute. Okay, so again, this is a critical juncture of American history. When American identity is put into question, who Americans are liberal Democrats or those deplorables, as Hillary Clinton called some of the competitors. So, and this is this is a habitual culture of to use foreign power, Russia, as a scapegoat, as a to export to the other that everything that Americans do not like at home. And this is how this Russian discourse reappeared during the last year in the United States. And what is bad is the consequences of this new wave of Russian discourse in the United States will have a very long, lasting legacies. Long after both President Trump and President Putin will be history, the legacy of the current rhetoric will be still poisoning Russian-American relations. The same way that now the Cold War rhetoric is still poisoning the Russian-American relations right now, and that will be for decades. Thank you for that.
Thank you. Okay, so next we have Marlene Laruelle of George Washington University, who will be speaking on Russian and U.S. far-right connections. Confluence, not influence.
Thank you, Henry. So in this paper, I was trying to disentangle one of the many conspiracy narratives that have been blossoming in the US about Russia being responsible for almost everything happening here in this country. And I was looking at the so-called connection between Russia and the US far right. And of course, that's an important issue because of the Trump's connection with Steve Bannon and because Trump repolarized US public opinion regarding its racist and segregationist past. But what is really interesting is that when you try to look at this Russia-US far-right connection, they are much more limited than what the media has been portraying. And it's really a good example of a media bubble. You have hundreds of articles about that. When you read all these articles, I don't know if I read the hundreds, but I read really a lot of them. You have about 10 facts that you can list, and that's all. And they are very anecdotal, which I will try to explain. So there are several elements that I would like to deconstruct here. The first one is that it's not because the two presidents in the US and in Russia are promoting so-called conservative agenda values that the far right has been gaining any access to decision-making circles, with the only exception of Bannon's being at the White House for several months and then leaving it. No far-right leaders have been kind of empowered in terms of decision-making, both in Russia and in the US, and I think it's important to remember because there tend to be a kind of narrative overlapping far-right and conservative, more mainstream politician. What these two presidents, by their narrative, or these two political systems have been doing, they have been unleashing some kind of street activism, Charlottesville for the US, Matilda as an example, in Russia for the recent months. So that's the first point. The second point is that all the media And all the comments have been about this alt-right movement being the most kind of visibly pro-Russian in the US political spectrum. I think this media visibility, the short one, and they are not so important. They are important for domestic US issues because they are representing this kind of revival of white supremacist theories under a new cover. But in the bilateral relation with Russia, I think they are much less important than some deeper and more longer trend, which are more related to Christian rights and the fact that you have a growing internationalization of pro-life and creationist movement coming from the US and kind of creating networks in Russia, in Europe, and in the Middle East. And I think if some connections are important in this kind of ideological world, it's more this kind of Christian radicalism than the pure kind of white supremacist narrative. Third point, yes, many of the alt-right figures are a big fan of Vladimir Putin. They like him for several reasons. They have several disagreements also with him that none of the two sides try to make too explicit. For example, seeing Putin as a representative of a kind of white world, which is something that Putin would not share. This narrative about kind of white race things is not the one that is going on in Russia. They would have some disagreement on Islam, but then they of course try to present the Russia as being exactly in tune with what the alt-right movement is pushing for. And what is my main point is that it's not because you have kind of mutual admiration on both sides of this US-Russia far-right and some shared worldview that you can demonstrate any kind of concrete interaction and even less any kind of Russian influence over that part of the US public opinion. So if we look at the data we have, what we can see, we see that several US far-right websites have been republishing, especially Alexander Dugin, because it's the kind of most fashionable and the one you can easily translate in English, or he can himself write in English for you, so he is the most kind of publicized. Then we know that Richard Spencer's former wife is from Russia, and she also has been translating Dugin books, and she has been publishing a lot of blogs about celebrating Putin's Russia and Novorossiya. Then we know that some, like 2-3 white supremacist activists have good connection in Russia with some kind of skinhead group because they were introduced by the former Ku Klux Klan leader David Duke when he was kind of touring in Russia and in Ukraine. They have been inviting Dugin several times to do Skype lecture because he cannot come in the US because he's under sanctions, so it's all about Skype conference in some small provincial US universities with like 10 people in the room. They have been, so the Jared Taylor, which is one of the big names of the white supremacy movement because he had this American Renaissance website, has been attending the famous 2015 Russian International Conservative Forum in St. Petersburg. Dugin has been interviewed by Alex Jones and his InfoWar website, and then he replicated so they both mutually interviewed each other. And then we know that the ultra-conservative internet channel in Russia, Tsargrad, which has been funded by Konstantin Malofeyev, the famous Orthodox businessman, employed a former Fox News producer who converted to Orthodoxy. And that's more or less all. Okay? So if you put all that together, it's relatively minor connection with relatively small circles of individuals. It's not bigger structure or institutionalized interaction. It's mostly around Dugin and some of his friends. It's not connection at a higher level of the Kremlin, which is one of the big differences with Russia's connection with the European far right, which happened at a more state official level with Narishkin and so on. On the US side, it's really very marginal with no kind of big figure on the Russian side being involved. Then clearly on the Kremlin side, there is no centralizing force that coordinates all this outreach effort to the Western far right. The topic has been highly divisive and many high-level figures in the Russian establishment do not support that policy. And that policy is clearly in retraction since the last few months, especially toward Europe. So I think if we really want to look at the kind of connection between Russia and the US, then it's more in the business world and the lobbying of big firms that the real issues are. It's clearly not on these kind of marginal far-right groups. And if we want to look at this more ideological only the ideological aspect of this connection, then as I said, the Christian right is more meaningful. And which means connection with the Russian Orthodox Church on the Russian side are more meaningful than any of this kind of white supremacist or Dugin type personality on the Russian side. So my conclusion on that is that there is an issue on the way usually Western experts are discussing so-called Russia soft power toward Western public opinion, because you have different ways of defining soft power. The kind of genuine soft power means that a country is able to shape another country's public opinion by shifting its perception and value. I think we have no evidence of anything happening, and Russia hasn't been able to shift perception and values of any other public opinion in the West. What we have is a kind of lighter soft power, which is just to follow what is fashionable or commonsensical in part of the other public opinion, to kind of share some agenda and interest. And I think really that it just, in fact, the Kremlin had been, or even not the Kremlin, but some figure in Russia trying to take advantage of this revival of the US far right to try to partner it, but there is really no influence at the grassroots level, and that's why the paper was about, like, it's not about influence, it's about confluence, because it's not Russia influencing anyone here. It's just some US person and some Russian one sharing a same agenda. And so I think it's much more important to think about Russia acting as an echo chamber of European and American kind of society's own doubts and transformation and issues, than to think that there is any kind of direct influence that can be shaped. And I think this kind of media bubble around the US-Russia far-right connection is a good example on how it's important to kind of look at the fact and deconstruct this kind of relationship. I will stop here.
Okay, terrific. Thank you. Okay, next we'll turn to Alexandra Yatsyk of Kazan Federal University in Russia, Visualizing the Enemy, Anti-American Propaganda and Russian Anti-Maidan Imagery.
So first of all, I'm not sure that my university is very happy that I'm here talking about anti-American propaganda, so I will prefer to be presented as a stipendiate of Polish-Russian Center for Understanding and Dialogue in Warsaw, so because I'm living in Warsaw. Just to and I would like to. What I have.
Just remember that little icon that we pushed on the other one.
Trust me, with this mouse, it's easier to get the big icon.
I would like to draw your attention to maybe another part of content, and do not go more focused on political statements or kind of this official stuff, and interfere a little bit and try to focus on cultural products and those which were produced by so-called patriotic singers in Russia. And I would like to be more focused on several misconceptions in Russian discourse, and focus on cultural products of such very important patriotic singers in Russia, like Night Waltz, White Club, and also Gleb Kornilov, who is a kind of rock singer in Russia. So I would say that there are 4 misconceptions about roots and agents of Russian patriotism. The first one is that Russian mainstream patriotic discourse is masterminded and coordinated by the Kremlin only. The second one, that Russian cultural background is very conservative, and that's why it can be described in terms of traditional ideological cliches. The third one is that Russian fighters in Donbass are mostly marginal figures, so like kind of Vatniki, but I would like to say that it's not exactly true. And the fourth one is that it's mostly the elderly people who tend to support imperial and Soviet nostalgic policies, and that's why it's just enough to wait a little bit, and this generation will gone, and we will have another Russia, more democratic one, and we have perspectives. It's also not true. My key argument is that the illiberal imagery of the post-Soviet world reduces, in Russia, reduces the validity of the major pillars of international society, like state territorial borders, national jurisdiction, citizenship, and legal obligation. And on top of that, Russian performative liberalism puts imaginary concepts such as patriotism, national spirit and pride, and natural bonds, defining them in sense of belonging to a trans-border political community named Russia. And the Russian liberalism, or liberal, so-called liberal patriotic discourse, stems from Russia's traumatic experience of losing empire. So this is my key argument. So if we look at polls, which was conducted by Levada Center in 2016, we see that anti-American feelings in Russian society tends to peak when the Russian government perceives geopolitical changes in Europe and Russia's near abroad as threatening Russia's interests in these regions. So we can see that the lowest level of friendly attitudes towards the U.S. was registered in 1999 when a NATO campaign against Serbia and Kosovo, in 2003 when the U.S. led invasion of Iraq, in 2008 when Russian Georgia won in August, and in 2018 when Euro-Maidan, as Ukrainian conflict in Eastern Ukraine, took place. And the second diagram also can show the same thing, and it also based on another opinion poll conducted by Levada Center in May 2016, and it also clearly demonstrates correlation between spikes in public distrust toward countries in Russia's far and near abroad, and major events such again as the relocation of so-called bronze soldier in Tallinn in 2008, so we can see this peak of unfriendly feelings towards Estonia in 2009, or Russian-Georgian war in August in 2008, and one also can see this peak on unfriendly feelings towards Georgia, and Ukraine during Maidan revolution in 2013, and the same thing. So, and also Turkey, and we see this Turkey peak of unfriendly feelings toward Turkey in 2015 when we have Russia-Turkey conflict. And for many Russians, an apparent irrationality of the military conflict in Donbass can be only explained through this external factor of U.S. influence in Ukraine, for instance, as evidences like this by photos of U.S. Assistant Victoria Nuland distributing cookies among Maidan activists in February 2014, and this image has been repeatedly reproduced by Russian popular culture, I would say, which crystallizes phantasms and stereotypes of the national consciousness. So another interesting example of this anti-Americanism is exemplified by large-scale performances held in Sebastopol since 2010 and organized by the Kremlin-patronized Night Balls by Club. Interesting that since 2012, Night Balls had about 60 million rubles granted them from president, and they're supported by multi-million ruble grants, and their shows transmitted on the Russian TV channel. So the shows are the focal points which state-sanctioned geopolitical imageries are manifested most loudly. And interesting, this script, this ideological script of these shows, which undergirds these performances, is comprised of Alexander Dugin's Eurasianisms and also the idea of katechonia, religious messianism. You can see this very clearly on this picture. And it's lavishly garnished with nostalgia for the formal imperial glory. And you can see on this picture a snapshot of the Night Waltz show Fort of Victory, Kuzniца Победы, in 2015 in Sebastopol, in which performer holds up the modified state emblem, in which hammer and sickle from the Soviet state are replaced by two-headed eagle in reference to the Russian Empire, with the Christian cross with Jesus in the background. So this is how Russians understand what is Russian idea currently is. And the prominence of the Cold War style anti-American element in this mix speaks of profound absence of ideological alternative to the West being the arch enemy. Another picture also clearly demonstrates this moment of kind of mix different stereotypes and using very old cliches. So this moment is highlighted in another show, in another Night Waltz show, Redemption in 2014, in which U.S. is portrayed as a global evil, as ultimate puppet master pulling the strings on the global place. So gigantic hands, as you can see, dangerously hanging over the globe, and bleeding Ukraine hard back in time of the familiar Soviet era cliche about the sticky fingers of capitalism, so загребущие лапы капитализма. And I would say that this geopolitical image can no longer rest on the binary communism-capitalism contest, because Russia is not hasn't capitalism anymore, and now Russia has been following the path of the free market capitalism. And in this regard, the heavy use of the Cold War era stock phrases, which occur within the larger anti-Western narrative of this show, shouldn't be confuse us into thinking that these efforts are somehow aimed at reviving the Soviet ideology. Another interesting point how anti-Americanism is presented in Russian patriotic discourse is a very corporeal language, which is used to present the idea of America. I would like to maybe show you a very short video clip to give you more ideas about that. Well. This is a song by Gleb Kornilov, who is really a very famous participant of his shows, and the song titled America.
Thank you.
So the idea is that Columbus please shut America because we were tired from it. And the interesting idea that, as seen from this perspective, America is represented as either like a woman in a bikini from resort and cruises and top made out of NATO armor, whose irrational behavior is due to her periods and hysteria, or a loser desperately dreaming about being a macho. And following the logic of his genre, key merits that are supported to demonstrate Russia's superiority over US global leadership ambitions are its vast territory, victory over Nazis in World War II, and pioneering space exploration. So I can say that these three pillars are the key pillars of current Russian patriotic discourse. And in this context, the Soviet ideology is replaced by the Russian Orthodox values, which in the past are juxtaposed against West decadent influence instead of Cold War era rotten capitalism cliches. So, despite the Soviet Union collapse, the propaganda employed the Night Waltz bike show uses Soviet era discourses schemes in which Russia is again pitted against the West in the new Cold War. While Russia is not longer Soviet Union, it is still unclear what the current Russian national idea is, and so we have this representational trap in national geopolitical consciousness, and I would say that we can explain it from psychoanalytical perspective, and if we use this psychoanalytical perspective, Crimea, Ukraine, and Donbass as are kind of objects whose recapturing promises restoration of an imaginary full identity of the Russian nation. But since any identity is a kind of incomplete identity, the construction of new fantasies, for example, about current Russian idea, patriotism, becomes an inevitable component of popular geopolitical aimed at stabilizing the mainstream worldview through their dramatic or oversimplifications. And here, interesting that sorry. Then,
We get the idea.
yeah. Here, the anti-Americanism in the Night Waltz show represents a compelling example of how Kremlin uses performances as hybrid policy tools. It's also a very important point because these singers of so-called singers of patriotism are not only singers anymore. They are fight with guns in their arms, and Night Waltz, representatives of Night Waltz bike clubs, as well as Gleb Kornilov, they are those who fight in Donbass for so-called Donbass Republic, and they also promote the idea of independent Donbass Republic, and they are not only kind of singers anymore. And I think that this is an interesting point as how Kremlin uses this cultural point as hybrid policy tools. So also interesting that at the same time these singers also kind of civil society, part of civil society in Russia, and focus their message on domestic audience and probably this aspect of participation with guns in their arms. I mean, the representative of this cultural producers in Russia is the most noteworthy aspect of their activity. So I would say that these singers kind of the Kremlin's political technologies, and the Night Waltz as well as Gleb Kornilov demonstrate how the distance between staging shows and mobilizing people for combat can be very short. It is very also important. So it also shows how easily the imperial aesthetics of widely consumed cultural fantasies can be imported onto a tight-knit network of militants. So it is not also only about creating fantasies, it's also about implementing fantasies in a very real life. And this is how Russia sees its national idea. And also maybe finally said that these guys are not representatives of this old generation who grew up in the Soviet era. They are from the new generation, from young people. They are young people. And they also reproduce their idea of Soviet imperialism or post-Soviet imperialism for their children as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, and then our last speaker on the panel will be Serghei Golunov from Kyushu University in Japan, and his talk is entitled "We Are Quits Now, Making Conspiracy Theories Normal Again in the Context of Russia-U.S. Relations."
Hands again.
Okay. Let me start with some theoretical points. First, this is a definition of conspiracy theories. It is an explanation of any events of referring to some secret actions of conspirators who, as a rule, pursue evil purposes. And conspiracy theories, in the most of cases, are represented as something bad, as something as a vice and pathologic kind of thinking that is logically flawed and paranoid. But the problem with there are some problems with these representations. The first and the most important problem is conspiracies rarely happen periodically. Second problem is virtually everybody, including myself, resort to conspiracies. It is, as psychiatrists used to say, that everybody is my patient. But it is important not to be have a very difficult patient. The third point is that the logic of theorizing in social sciences reminds conspiracy theories by some important features. And taking this into account, some conspiracy studies scholars try to distinguish between acceptable and bad conspiracy theories, warranted and non-warranted, and also there is a phenomenon of conspiracyism, that is systematic belief in key and omnipresent role of conspiracies in historical process. But there is a risk of considering warranted by default those conspiracy theories that blame bad actors and of considering unwarranted those conspiracy theories that blame good actors. For example, anti-US conspiracy theories can be represented as irrational in the USA, while anti-Russian conspiracy theories can be represented as unwarranted in Russia. It depends on political viewpoint. And the last important theoretical point is functions. Usually, there is a lot of functions that conspiracy theories can play, that is making sense of seemingly chaotic reality and providing clear explanation for experienced problems, for example, of Trump's victory. Empowering conspiracy theorizers and disempowering the opponents. Mobilizing support of conspiracy for conspiracy theorizers. Providing popular and profitable entertainment plots. And here are some historical trends. just in brief, here are some Russian trends. Before Peter the Great, foreigners were represented as defiling agents of devilry. After that, things became more mild. Foreigners represented as foreign spies. Jews were represented as secret organization who tried to seize power. Germans were represented as the fifth column. And in the Soviet period, foreigners were represented. Foreign influence, foreign evil influence was represented as the network of spies trying to undermine Soviet order by various means. And if in post-Soviet period, conspiracy theories theorizing got more diversified. Western agents are still here. The USA is definitely the conspiring actor #1 in Russian conspiracy theories, and the adjacent state who allegedly tried to seize some Russian territory are conspiracy actors number 2, 3, 4, etc. And here are some American trends. Before the 20th century, there were some alleged networks of Masons, Catholic and capitalist oligarchs. From the World War I, there were 2 Red Scares and also some other malicious actors. And in the late Soviet period, conspiracy theorizing in the USA tended to shift towards some global conspiracy theorizing, some global forces allegedly trying to subdue or seize the USA with the help of UN forces, for example. And global secret organizations probably prevail now, but Russian scare is here in this decade. Here again. These are some recent developments. In Russia, anti-American rhetoric has been particularly prominent since the last electoral cycle, since 2011-2012 electoral cycle. It is about disempowering of pro-American supposed alleged fifth column that is used as a major pretext for crackdown on civil liberties and also to legitimize Putin's regime, rely its supporters, and to boost ratings of anti-Western and anti-opposition so-called revealing documentaries. And at the same time, it is interesting that Russian-Chinese rapprochement disempowers anti-China conspiracy theorizing. Again, China is conspiracy actor #2 after the USA. In the USA, Russian annexation of Crimea induced some local fears among Alaskan population that Russia can repeat this Crimean scenario. And especially during and after the presidential campaign, alleged Russian connections of Donald Trump have become a target for his political opponents seeking to disempower the president. So American conspiracy theorizing, current America's anti-Russian conspiracy theorizing, it looks at it is at first about disempowerment. Some accusers. Well, some this conspiracy theorizing can have its ground, but heavy conspiracism sentiments are still here. Trump that portray Trump as a Russian puppet and frame Russia as nearly omnipresent force trying to destroy the very U.S. democracy. It is conspiracism. And it is interesting that now both Russia and USA employ anti-conspiracy rhetoric actively. Normally, in the post-Soviet period, the US mainstream discourse was more rationalistic in this respect than Russian one. Russian conspiracy theorizing moves were framed as absurd and paranoid, but now both sides use nearly the same rhetorics. They employ well-developed anti-conspiracy rhetoric to dismiss opponents' claims. For example, recently Vladimir Putin and other Russian high-standing politicians, for example, Lavrov, Zakharova, who are proficient in conspiracy theorizing themselves, concurrently show their proficiency in dismissing US conspiracy theorizing, using some rhetorical devices such as pointing to the lack of evidence and to availability of alternative explanations, accusing advocates of conspiracy narratives of pursuing unscrupulous political interests, whataboutism, reduction ad absurdum and irony, pathologization and denigration of US proliferators. And here come conclusions. First, in the contemporary Russian-US relations, conspiracy theorizing about external enemies gradually becomes a mutually enforced normality rather than a bad manner. However, conspiracy theories still do not play equivalent roles in US and Russian politics, especially from the functional point of view. In both countries, conspiracy theorizing is currently used for delegitimizing political opponents, but in Russia, both functions are more prominent, and that is more important. In Russia, conspiracy theorizing is heavily used for authoritarian regimes' self-legitimation and in some cases for mobilizing supporters, while American conspiracy theorizing is first of all about delegitimizing. And here are some pictures. That one, that is below is about the most recent genetic weapons conspiracy that the US allegedly collects genetic samples of Russian to invent some biological weapon that directed against Russians selectively. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. So our speakers were all very attentive to timing considerations, so we actually have about 20 minutes for discussion. So let me just collect maybe a few questions or very brief comments for the speakers to react to. So floor is open. Yes, please.
Yes.
If you could just identify yourself, please.
Oh, certainly. My name is Robert Stepanek. I'm a journalist and a polemicist, I should say. But the question relates to the connection between the alt-right and Russia, as well as the anti-Maidan and anti-American propaganda. And it seems to me that the issue that you have that may be a genuine connection rather than surmounting a false connection between the right and Russia is one of identitarianism. If you read the alt-right, generally there's not necessarily a unanimity of position, but identitarianism is an aspect, and certainly Russia and Putin has drawn upon identitarianism with Russian identity also, the idea of the greater Russia and the transnational Russian community. The other issue that generally animates the alt-right, I would say, is separatism rather than supremacism. And so there I think there may be a gulf between the two, that there's more of Russian supremacism that animates the transculturalism that they're pursuing, whether it's the greater Russia, Novorossiya, that sort of thing. And and I think the other aspect of the right identifying with Russia has to do with the fact that most quote-unquote white nations, or the Western nations, are aggressively pursuing policies of multiculturalism. We've certainly seen this with all these refugees flooding into Europe, whereas
Maybe
Russia...
very briefly, sorry.
Okay, sorry, I'm
Yeah.
just about finished. Whereas Russia's position not one sort of multiculturalism, but more maybe transculturalism emerging from the Soviet Union. So, just some ideas to throw out there.
Okay. Thank you. Yes, Kim.
My question is for Alexandra. It was a fascinating presentation, and I'm sort of channeling here Janet Johnson, who isn't here, but she has done some work recently on Putin's masculinity and on how the masculinity is a part of sort of the whole ideological basis for how Putin presents himself. And I'm just wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about the presentation of the United States as being the woman in this video clip. Do you think that that was particularly tied to Hillary Clinton? Or is there some, to use the language that feminist theorists might use, is there some other trope that's being called upon here? Why would this have such a great resonance among the Russian population?
Okay, good. Any thought?
I'd like to ask Ivan. I do like his approach very much, and so my question is whether any other countries, like France, for example, played the same role of scapegoats, or if you are a specialist in Russian-American relations, could you please find symmetrical things when, for Russia, the United States played a similar role? One more question to Marlene. I'm a little bit surprised by the fact that Dugin was welcomed here by somebody with his position, which is anti-American position. So, what were the reasons for them to invite him? And just 2 words about Alexandra's presentation. I would not say that this is propaganda. I've seen recently the movie Ivan was commenting on Russian-American relations, between military. It was extremely positive with regard to about 19th century Russian-American relationship, and these are marginal. So you can find several impressive images of persons who never were anyhow popular, and it's understandable that if the United States are considered to be the enemy by 70–80% of Russians, some of them do use this and do exploit these feelings. But do you think this is really propaganda, or this is just like, say, you can find something anti-American, something anti-Russian, something anti-whoever?
Okay, yeah, that's one more, and then we'll take a round and ask people to be brief, and then we'll open it up.
Well, I was very glad that you characterized the Russian control of the U.S. election as a conspiracy theory, because it is really quite a wild theory, particularly if you ignore the fact that Hillary Clinton ran a really lousy campaign and was connected, that faction of the Democratic Party, into the Wall Street Democrats. It's a big issue now within the Democratic Party, with people who oppose their economic policy and the war policy, including regime change, which has been pretty devastating. So I was glad that you did this, and I wonder why the actual question of what happened in the American election is not considered when people discuss it, and the assumption is just that there had to be something done about Trump, and ignoring the other side of what actually happened in the election.
Okay, how many hands do we have up? Okay, I guess we have 2 more. Maybe let's just go ahead and take those, and then we'll give the rest of the time to the speakers, and if we have a little extra time, we can take more. So Josh and the gentleman in the back again.
Okay, so I have a question for Alexandra, and then a kind of comedy question for Marlene. So Alexandra, I wonder if you could just speak a little bit to how we kind of link up the images you've shown us here and the discussion you've given us of a sort of anti-Americanism among Russian youth with the images and the examples of the protests, the sort of Navalny protests that took place in March and June, which were heavily oriented around young people, and how we should think about the kind of overlap between those two. Like, so are we seeing a sort of bifurcated divide within Russian youth where you're either pro-Putin or you're anti-Putin? Or are these things actually overlapping, where, and this is sort of Navalny's thing, that you can be anti-corruption at the same time that you can have a kind of pro-patriotic, anti-US attitude? So I'd love to hear just a little bit more about how those kind of fit together. And then Marlene, I just want to ask the question, and we can talk more about this later, but that I think one link potentially between the alt-right in the United States and what's going on with the Russian government may not have to do with direct links in terms of collaboration, but might actually have to be more of a kind of technological link of using and copying tools, right? And so some of the tools that the Russian government had developed within the context of Russian domestic politics, such as trolling and bots and these sorts of things on the internet, these kinds of tools which allow the government to sort of try to control the tenor of discussion online, engage, shape the discussion online, I think are tools that may have been picked up by the far right to amplify, to sort of amplify their message and allow a smaller group of the population to appear larger in the online conversation. So it's more of a comment than a question, but this might be another interesting area to sort of look at these kind of links here, especially if it turns out that there are like some very direct technological links here. So it may not be ideas necessarily being shared so much as tactics.
Okay,
Yeah,
yeah,
a story now, Morris. There's a counter tradition to us being in awe of Russia. I mean, you know, boy, did they pull a fast one with selling Alaska. Man, they're Sharpies. We're not too bright. Wow, look at those novels. Man, we can't compete with these writers. That's, you know, moving up this century. Man, look at them dumping out these refugees we're getting. Poor people. Man, it's like this Cuban thing. They're taking advantage of us there. Wow, they dominate world chess until Bobby Fischer. Their mentality is, wow, it must be a little sharper than I. And they have every spy in every department of FDR's government. Incredible people. I can't believe it. Man, little it's a counter tradition to the you know, fall guy Russia. It's the Superman Russia.
Okay, well, great. So maybe let's just start with Yvonne and then go in the order that people are sitting at the table, and maybe about 3 minutes each, 2 to 3
Okay.
ish. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Nikolai. Well, I have less to say about France, but still, I will probably try with start with Napoleon, who, okay, already in the St. Helens Island once told that in 20 years Europe will be either Republican or Cossack, meaning either Americanized or Russianized. And for, you know, for Europe, for France, particularly for Europe, for at least since Napoleon, to be Europe is meant to be like between two extremes, and two extremes were represented by Russia and by the United States. But this is a kind of a popular geopolitics, which is, as for a Russian use of course, Russia use the United States the same, sometimes the same way that Americans use it. The most recent example was after the 2011-2012 public protest, when actually the state used, well, you know, this was very simple invention or revitalization of the idea that all the opponents of opposition are somehow connected to the United States, and the United States is an evil, demonic country which you know, plotting against you know, the very heart of the Russian soul. And this too means, you know, you cannot just link the opposition to America without demonizing the United States, because, you know, if the United States is a good country, what better to be, you know, linked to the United States. And so it went together. And by the way, this is interesting that after Trump came to power, still with all of the deterioration of the relations, with all of this mutual expellation of diplomats, the Russian propaganda is not as bad about America as it used to be. I mean, that actually is some hope to part of the liberal opposition, because without demonizing America, well, the regime is maybe less tough against the political opposition, which is an interesting coincidence. But Russian view on America is more complex, because for Russia, America was always a significant other since the 19th century, you know, from Decembrists who used American constitutions as a model. And Russian, well, to make it simple, Russian views on America is going cycles, you know, the cycles from when Russia is in the reformist part of its cycle, when the Russian government or Russian society wants to reform the country, the United States immediately appears as a model, as a pattern, as something to draw the good lessons. And this was several times, and it's, you know, for technocratic or for revolutionary is the same. Like for technocratic Nicholas I, the United States was a source for engineering, innovations, railroads, telegraph. And for revolutionary Decembrists, the United States was a source and model for constitution. And for Bolsheviks in the 20s, the United States was a model. For Khrushchev, Gorbachev, and even Medvedev, the United States was repeatedly the model. And for every time that when a Russian cycle went to the another part of its cycle, to the freezing, to, you know, when the regime wanted to hold on and to freeze the society, the United States immediately turned to be a threat and to be a foe, and it was all the time. Again, we can start with the 19th century, it's repeatedly the same. And so this is, it's a little bit more complex because for Russia, America was always a part of its, parts of the internal domestic debates. In the United States, there were periods of time when Russia wasn't, like, previous decade, for instance. But the United States continued to be the major.
Thank you. Marlene?
Yeah, so 1 minute per question. Josh, it's a good point. I haven't worked on that. I would think that the kind of cyber tool that Russia is using are more coming from the kind of advertising, marketing world than from the far right. I think they are more looking at that and how to use that. But
the other way. The other way, that the far right in the U.S., the alt-right in the U.S. has actually learned from what utilized tools that Russians developed over the last 4 or 5 years in online media.
Yeah, well, I don't know. I would think that the far right has been having long time strategy. Has been building its own strategy to amplify its own narrative since, before Russia played with cyber tools. But what is sure is that on the construction of the conspiracy, there are a lot of interchanging elements, and clearly a lot of Russian conspiracy theories are originated in the West, the same way as the one in the Middle East also originated in the West. Kolya, the question on Dugin. Dugin, he has multiple identities and he can play on multiple kind of narrative. The narrative that makes him legitimate here is not the narrative about Eurasia and geopolitical opposition to the US. It's a narrative about white identity, kind of Aryan, Hyperborean, neo-Nazi, all this kind of mythology that resonate with some of the white supremacists here. And so there is a kind of conflict because it's much more pro-Muslim than what white supremacists are here. So he has this kind of double identity, the kind of white product to sell here and the other one. And what also makes the connection is that his anti-US, anti-NATO narrative resonates well with the anti-federal state of these white supremacists. So that's the same kind of narrative, that Washington, all these federal states, they are not real Americans, it's all Jewish. So on that, they can share this part also of the narrative. And on the first question about identitarianism, there are some identitarian people in Russia, some far-right thinker. I don't think Putin can be considered as an identitarianist, because identitarianism, as it has been constructed in the US and it's originated from France, it's very much based on race, it's very much anti-empire, while Putin's narrative is really not based on race. It's really much more pro-imperial than anti-imperial. It's anti-multiculturalist in the Western sense, but it's in favor of kind of common destiny of several of the nations of the Eurasian space. So it's not anti kind of interaction between different cultures. On the contrary, it's built on the narrative like dialogue of civilization and culture that Russia represents. So I don't think we can make that connection with the Putin's regime and this kind of identitarianism narrative in the West.
Okay, thank you. Serghei.
Okay, concerning Russian interference into the US election, my point was not about denying it, but about not going too far and not falling into conspiracism. It is important to stop at some point and to consider alternative explanations properly and to, for example, to respond questions about to what extent Russian influence really shaped the result, or to what extent Russian connections do really matter. If some stresses point of with Russian interference into US elections too firmly, one probably will have to deal with whataboutism. Can you be sure that the USA never tried itself to meddle into Russian elections? The outcome of it is probably modest, but if you ought to fight a presumption of guilt, it will be difficult to dismiss it.
Okay, Kazan.
Okay, to Kim about Hillary Clinton. So I'm not very well known about her images in Russia, but during the election, hackers also used the same things in terms of representing her. So, for instance, in October, they posted on her on her pages in Wikipedia kind of porno content, and with comments about that if she will be elected, the nuclear war is unavoidable, and her husband will continue to rape women, etc. So it means that the opponent, especially if it is a woman, also represents a kind of as a very weak candidate because of women, and also kind of irrational candidate with a very hysterical candidate, etc. So, I mean, this gender-focused narrative is very much used in this sense as well. So to Nikolai about marginal figures, I don't think so, because as I mentioned, I just used that example to, I mean, this clip to show you because, how America is represented, because it's very, I mean, elucidate how it is. But as I mentioned, Gleb is a constant participant of this bike show, which is supported by President, by Putin, is multi-milliard shows, which is translated by the First Channel. So I mean, these are not marginal figures if I participate in these shows. And also very interesting question maybe to Artemi, why, for instance, old rock stars participated also in this show, like for instance, Kipelov or Butusov. So they are also participating in the show. So it's a very interesting question. Why? And about images of Navalny protest, I think that, as I mentioned, they are not overlapping actually, because they are representing, they use different tools for representing Russia. So in case of Navalny, they're trying to use this so-called liberal imagery, which appealing to the ideas of national borders, corruption, I mean, kind of rational ideas on national jurisdictions, citizenships, law, etc. But in terms of this patriotic discourse, as I said in the beginning of my presentation, they use such kind of terms as national spirit, bonds, natural bonds, or patriotism, and this is kind of irrational terms or concepts which we can explain with using of toolkit of these liberal concepts, and this is difference between them.
Okay, please join me in thanking our panel. So we'll now have about a 45-minute session just for general discussion about themes related to the year after Trump's election. So we'll just invite, I guess, Josh to come up here to the front, and our other panelists, other than Marlene can stay. If anybody needs a minute to get a drink or something, we'll start up in just a minute or so.
That's what you said about friends, and that we should be writing what we are living. How you combine the monarchy, you celebrate the French kingdom and the wife and
I consider that Thomas Jefferson had two busts, of Napoleon and Alexandra I, Russian monarch, in his study. He said Napoleon was a representation of tyranny, and Alexander of freedom.
Yeah, please, you go ahead and start now.
All right. So our plan for this final session was not to actually make people sit around for another hour and listen to presentations here, but just given the fact that we had so many presentations on the schedule and we were limited in the amount of time that we had, and also given the sense that there are, you know, unlike certain conferences, there are some sort of overarching questions that we're asking here, and so there's a lot of chance to sort of draw connections across the panels. So our thought was we would just save a little bit of time at the end of the day to have a general discussion about some of the themes that were raised today and give people a sort of chance to weigh in collectively on things that they've learned about today or thought about today and things like that. So that's by way of saying two things. One, if we're all exhausted, we don't have to go to 6 o'clock. On the other hand, if the conversation is fascinating, we have the room and we can continue to go for a while. And second of all, I wanted to give Henry a chance, who hasn't spoken today, to sort of kick us off on discussion and offer some opening thoughts on this. And Marlene, you may have a few things that you want to add at this point as well. So.
Okay. Do you want to go? Yeah. Okay. All right. Yeah. So I want to thank everybody for a really fascinating discussion. So I thought I'd just offer a few kind of starting reflections, sort of building on Josh's great introductory comments. And I mean, I think kind of one of the takeaways I come away from this discussion is, you know, that we're in fact facing a very dangerous time with a lot of hostility, both the elite and mass level, you know, among not just the United States and Russia, but involving Ukraine as well, and policymaking circles, and that we have conflicts throughout the world that put us in a very dangerous situation, and so we're in a very serious problem, or in a very serious situation. And it's both a good thing and a bad thing for us as analysts. You know, primarily the presenters are social scientists, and we're much better at explaining the causes of things and explaining the complexities, you know, than we are really at identifying, well, okay, how do we get out of this situation productively? So, you know, I had a lot of takeaways in terms of the, you know, situation that we're in. You know, I mean, I think maybe some of the good news that comes out of this is, you know, I don't see anybody saying that sort of, you know, the leaderships of both countries are, you know, determined to bring us into nuclear war, or, you know, I think there's sort of a desire for some kind of peaceful solution on all sides. But there are a lot of problems which theories of international relations suggest are actually quite formidable and dangerous, that we have to address. And of course the biggest one probably is just, well, okay, peace is great, but peace on whose terms, right? I think both sides would love a peace in which their own interests are recognized. And what we have is a situation, even, you know, setting aside questions of which side is right and which side is wrong, you know, of two sides being willing to accept a high degree of risk of conflict, of further conflict, to get its version of a somehow, you know, peaceful settlement. And this, we might not have arrived at this situation in a cautious manner, but at least that seems to be the situation that we're in. And the reasons that are brought by each side seem somehow incompatible, which I think makes it particularly difficult. A second problem, which I see coming out of a lot of the presentations, is that there are forces within each country, some that prefer some kind of moderation, but a lot of them actually may have some interest in escalation for one reason or other as the way to go forward. So on the Russian side, you know, we heard you know, Kim Martin's presentation about, you know, the possible interest that Shemezov and others might have an interest in arms sales promotion, which could be an interest in conflict. At the level of public opinion, leadership might have an interest in conflict to generate rallying around the flag effects. And on the United States side, you know, there's a widespread opinion among a lot of people that, you know, certain actions of the Russian Federation are intolerable and, you know, therefore need to be resisted and punished, and making it even, you know, more complicated is that it's unclear even what that policy is sometimes. So there's a certain sense in which there are a number of two-level games going on, and public opinion, moreover, seems to be not a strong constraint towards either side. I think that's an area which will be interesting to debate, but it seems, at a minimum, somewhat manipulable on both sides, impacted by partisanship, you know, lenses of partisanship, how one interprets international affairs. So basically we have sort of two-level games, you know, leaders that are both engaged in battles within their own elites, negotiating with public opinion. At the same time, they're negotiating with others in unpredictable environments where you have very serious differences. And so, and I think some of these differences seem to be, deeply rooted in interests. Others might be related to values. And I guess I would say, further complicating things, it would be nice, as I think kind of Vladimir Dubovik kind of hinted at earlier, that to just be able to talk about U.S.-Russian relations, but as he observed, and as I think many of the presentations here indicated, you can't talk about that without including other actors that are directly affected and are effectively veto players. It's sort of a standard axiom of like negotiations theory that you have to have all the major veto players involved in order for a legitimate solution. So we need to have Ukrainians at the table, especially when it regards the conflict on Ukrainian territory. Then you have the European Union and others involved, and all this just makes it extremely complicated. Because when you have all these uncertainties and incoherences and interlocking problems, it seems like it's very difficult to change certain things. So it seems like Russia's unlikely to give up Crimea. Ukraine, the U.S., and most of the West are likely not to accept it in the future. Sanctions seem quite likely to be sticky, at a minimum for political reasons, even apart from whether people think they're justified or not. And regime change also seems unlikely in the countries involved. In that light, I was kind of looking in the memos for different possible solutions that people have advanced. And in fairness, that was not the objective. Like, we didn't ask people for this, and I know people in their other work have had, like whole reports proposing different ways forward. But it's interesting that kind of the impetus is to focus a lot on the problems, and there don't seem to be any strong solutions, and the solutions that are suggested are often point in different directions. Some seem to imply that, well, maybe removing sanctions is relatively ineffective, or counterproductive might be the way to go to develop other kinds of transformative economic interests. But on the other hand, others would argue that the West needs to take measures to demonstrate resolve, augmenting sanctions, arming Ukraine further in order to force Putin to the negotiating table, which could ultimately provide a resolution. Influencing public opinion in both countries seems difficult to do in a systematic manner, although everybody tries to do it as we can. There's even dispute on kind of where we really have areas of genuine common interest, especially when it gets complicated. Maybe at the abstract, the national level, we can think about interests against counterterrorism, but once you break down, if you conceive of foreign policy as being about competing elite interests, maybe even that becomes difficult. Which isn't to say we shouldn't advocate for that, but I think kind of the question that I would sort of be interested in people's thoughts, among other things, is kind of what are the areas that some kind of positive movement forward could be had, and is it not would it not be the case that maybe the best we can do is basically just kind of wait it out, focus on trying to make things not get worse on these areas of kind of deadlock. Which would involve concrete policies like maximizing communications among the sides, exchanges between students, professionals, what have you, military to military contacts, visa openings, and again, I'm not talking just Russia-U.S., but Ukraine, what have you, kind of pushing for those sorts of things, and maybe just hope that time will produce some new contingencies, especially thinking over the decade. I want to think that that's not the best solution, but I did want to toss that out there. So.
Yeah, just very briefly, two very very modest, limited comments, and that are kind of following what Henry was saying. The first one is, of course, this kind of elephant in the room about the U.S. perception and the place of Russia in the U.S. domestic context since last year. And so I was wondering, how do we think scholars should kind of work in this kind of environment, which I found really kind of oppressing. How do we want to be part of that discussion and feel we need to be involved, or we consider we cannot be involved because that's happening at a level that is kind of too far away from academic production? Third level would be, how do we want to study what is happening? And in that case, it means that as a Russian expert, we are suddenly also trying to look at US domestic issues. And I don't know if I'm saying it too boldly but I was surprised to see not so many kind of large discussion about academic community on Russia, about what is going on here about Russia. And so I was wondering if that has also to do with the fact that the political culture of the Democrats has been shifting so much since last year about Russia, and the fact that the majority of the academia would be more on the Democrat side than on the Republican, that suddenly created difficulties between being a scholar and being a citizen and trying to identify which kind of role Russia has been really playing and how do we want to study what is happening here, not only on the Republican side, but now also on the Democrat side. And the second element, which is also kind of following what Henry was saying about Ukraine, but I would make it bigger, is that when we are discussing US-Russia relations, I always have a kind of surge of my European identity, and I always feel like, well, you know, it's not bilateral issues, and it's not only trilateral with Ukraine. There should be probably more about Europe, not only in terms of us acting more with European scholars, but also how do we want people, US scholars working on Russia, knowing more about what is happening in Europe, to be able to put Europe in their picture of trying to understand Russia. Because my impression is that very often the knowledge about the Europeans' public opinion in all their diversity about Russia is relatively low, and that makes kind of black and white perception, while if you integrate the European perspective, it makes things largely more complicated, and in a sense, I think that should really be part of the discussion. That's all.
Okay. Thanks. So I had a chance to speak at the beginning, so I just want to make two brief points and then toss it open for discussion. A couple of observations. One is that I have been struck by the fact that there was so little discussion of North Korea today. Other than I think it was Vladimir who had a throwaway line early on who said, well, in a couple of years, the Korean Peninsula is going to be reunified.
So now we all know.
Right. So I'm kind of curious on how that's going to come about. But I do want to raise this because, again, when I sort of threw out, and to explain the English metaphor I used earlier today, or the expression, the dog that caught the car, for those of you who are not familiar with this expression, it's that dogs chase cars all the time, right? So there's this whole thing where dogs are always running around after cars, and then people will say, well, what would the dog actually do with the car if it actually caught it, right? So we have this expression in English, the dog that caught the car, is like if you're trying to get something and then suddenly you get it, you don't know what to do with it, right? So that was the idea there. And I do think that, you know, that when and again, we haven't really talked too much about this, about, you know, weakening NATO and what Trump may have done for the NATO commitment. And there were things in the first couple of months that when Flynn was still, or first few days when Flynn was still in office, that looked more likely in the aftermath of that and the pre-McMaster's tape. But nevertheless, there is a question to be asked about, as much as there's been a long-term you know, that Putin has this, you know, sort of Putin's Kremlin has this, or at least Putin 2.0 has this, you know, real retribution to weaken NATO in response to Ukraine, in response to lots of other things, you know, this long-running thing about whether Russia's real threat comes from the West today, and whether weakening NATO so that Germany doesn't decide to invade Russia is the big issue, as opposed to instability coming from the East. And it was interesting talking about the fewer conspiracy theories about China, hearing a bit about that today in the final talk of the day. Again, you know, contrasting this with the sort of long-term concerns about demographics within Russia and China and the Chinese in the eastern part of Russia and what's happening in these kind of long-term things. And so I am kind of curious about the Korean Peninsula and how this kind of relates to the story that we've talked a bit about today, because this does seem, if we're going to throw around nuclear war, right, we're not thinking really the Russians and Americans are going to start lobbing nuclear weapons at each other. Whether there's going to be things lobbed over North Korea is another matter entirely, right? And what does that mean for Russian security? I mean, it's a country that, you know, it's in its backyard. So I think that's one thing I might be interested in hearing more people's thoughts about right now. And then I just want to push on one thing, which actually was in the very first talk of the day, so to give us some circularity here, about what Arkady was saying about the Trump euphoria. And I was kind of struck by that talk, which sort of got exactly to, again, this question that I was raising in the very beginning about these images of the Russian Duma clapping, and then and then, you know, it came out that Russia was actively working to try to help Trump get elected. And this question that I raised in the beginning about the sort of, so what does that mean for the Kremlin's ownership of the Trump administration? And I felt like a lot of the talk that went on today, and even in particular, and even in Henry's remarks now about the sort of pessimism about how things are difficult between the countries and everything like that, and that there's just been this shift back to saying, oh, okay, it's easy to just, from within the context of Russian domestic politics, that's what I want to talk about in this two-layer game. Is it really easy to just make that shift back and make it go away and say, you know what, we said all these good things about Trump, we were happy about him getting elected, we told you for years that Clinton was going to ruin everything, that she was the cause of everything terrible, and she didn't get elected, but by the way, it doesn't matter, because the American system has just re-equilibrated, and the Congress has, John McCain has silenced Trump, and it doesn't matter at all. But again, there's some tension there, and some contrast with this idea of, you know, Putin saying, oh, it was good that you fired Dan Rather, right? Like, how do we go from this idea of the all-powerful leader to suddenly saying that Trump is irrelevant, right, in vis-a-vis Russia? So I just kind of wonder what I would love to hear more about the sort of long-term lingering effects of the post-Trump euphoria. Yes, things didn't work out the way, but again, we're having this conversation here about things deteriorating, about relations being really bad for the country, almost like this whole idea that the Russians really sought to have, you know, that really wanted to not have a particular candidate get elected. That candidate was not elected. The Russians' chosen candidate was elected. And does that have any sort of longer term effect on this dynamic, on this story we're talking? I mean, Henry, listening to your remarks, I couldn't help but think like, oh, yeah, you could have been saying the exact same thing if Hillary Clinton had been elected president, right? And the title of the workshop was 1 year after Trump's election. So I come back to the thing that I said, like, did it make any difference? And with that, I'll throw it out to open to the discussion. Yeah.
Do you want to take it?
Sure, yeah. Kolya and then Kim.
Okay, just a couple of points. I did like our workshop very much. The only thing I missed was a kind of symmetry. So I would offer, if to work further on our presentations, it would be good to compare one side with other side. Like, say, I was dealing with Russian domestic politics, and it would be very interesting to compare it to American domestic politics. And one thing which is very important after what has happened a year ago is astonishing similarity in some cases, which I, for example, I would never have in mind. Similarity between how to manipulate public opinion in one country and how to manipulate public opinion in other country, how personalistic regime can be or can try to be in one country and in other country. And I think Ivan is absolutely right when speaking about very long negative effect. And I would say that, in my view, we today sounded a little bit more optimistic than the situation is. And the situation is very dangerous. And the fact that public opinion is that easily manipulated means that inertia will be huge. It's easy now to shape this public opinion, either with regard to Russia and the United States or with regard to the United States and Russia. But this public opinion will shape politics for years ahead. And before George did explain this expression, my reading was similar to Russian fables like Slon and Moiska, like Dog and the Elephant. And in my view, and my professional idiocy is time and space analysis. And I would say that, in my view, who is the car and who is the dog, or in my case, elephant and the dog, differs depending on the scale. At the global scale, it's understandable that the United States is more like a car and Russia is like a dog. In case of Ukraine, it's absolutely different, by the way. And I do remember that in 2013, during our PONARS event, it was summer 2013, we met with State Department guys dealing with Ukraine. And it was at a time when all these negotiations about association agreement were going on. And I was very much negative with regard to possible Russia's Putin's reaction. Both Ukrainians and State Department ladies who were not very well familiar with our part of the world were very optimistic on the base of the fact that Russia is nothing in comparison to Europe, in comparison to the West in general. It happens very, very differently, and the same is with sanctions. If to look at longer perspective, sanctions are extremely powerful and extremely negative for Russia. But it depends whether rules of the game will be the same. Unlike Volodya, I would easier imagine unification of Russia and Northern Korea than Northern Korea with Southern Korea. And I'm afraid that the same is with sanctions. Like say 2008, Georgia war, Russian-Georgian war, and well, almost no reaction, not due to stupidity of Western leaders that time, but due to the fact that financial crisis took place and it did overshadow this. If, for example, American president will decide to act decisively in case of Korea and will start real conflict there, and the other side is absolutely irrational or can be irrational, then if to imagine what can happen there, then all these sanctions, all these quarrels between Russia and the West will be considered to be absolutely negligible. So that's why I would say that depending on space and depending on time, prospects can be different. And I would remind you the fact that Putin, unlike almost all American presidents after the Second World War, is lucky in many different ways. So he is waiting for the new lucky chance, and unfortunately, perhaps for the country, but fortunately for him, he does have certain grounds to wait for this.
Kim?
I have some comments for several people. For Henry, I think one way of looking at the future way out would be to think about limiting conflict rather than actively cooperating. And those two things kind of get confused. And I had a conversation recently off the record with somebody who had been very much involved in the Obama administration, who was saying essentially that, you can't have any cooperation after what Russia did, blah, blah, blah. But that was thinking in terms of these very big moves towards cooperation and not in terms of conflict limitation. And during the height of the Cold War, it was conflict limitation that we were focused on rather than out-and-out cooperation, and that might help. And just to give a little self-promoting plug, I have a piece coming out in the forthcoming issue of the New Republic, where I give some suggestions about limiting conflict. To Marlene, I think the way that you deal with the elephant in the room is by collecting evidence. And that is what separates social science from conspiracy theory. It's not the theorizing, it's the using evidence to test the theories. And I would say that we have really strong evidence on two aspects of what Russia did. And what's really interesting is that they didn't, either of them come from US government sources. The first came from CrowdStrike, and it was confirmed by two other firms, including FireEye, and I can't remember what the third one was, that the GRU, the Russian Military Intelligence Agency, was responsible for the hacking of the DNC. So that is probably pretty close to being a fact. And the second thing that is a fact, because we know it from Facebook and from Twitter, is that there were purchases of what looked like accounts that were not actually accounts that came from this Russian firm located in St. Petersburg. If you go beyond those two sets of facts, we don't really know anything more. But on those two things, I mean, there's just overwhelming evidence that those two things did happen. And that doesn't mean that they necessarily had any impact on the outcome of the election. And so I think as social scientists, it's important for us to keep the evidence and the conspiracy theories separate from each other. To Nikolai, we were talking about similarities. I think that one thing that has happened in the United States in the past, 9 months, 10 months, is that I, at least, and I would imagine if it's true of me, it's true of other people too, we have been shocked at the level of high-level corruption and shenanigans that have become accepted in politics and nobody cares. And I would say that that is a similarity between the US and Russia, that if you told me this a year and a half ago, I never would have thought would come to pass. And I am starting to think about the United States in Henry Hale's terms of having these dual control systems. And I'm just shocked that I am thinking about it that way. And then just one final thing that I'd like to say is that I'm not afraid of a nuclear war. I am terrified of a cyber war. And I think that there is a real possibility that if things continue to go on this way, that it's the U.S. is going to suffer because the U.S. is probably much more vulnerable to civilian-based cyber attacks than Russia is, to the extent that I'm really afraid that Russia could decide at some point, that Putin could decide at some point to have a major outage of a civilian infrastructure system in the United States, and there's not a damn thing the United States can do about it.
Pauline?
Just to react on your saying that you are not afraid of nuclear war. Of course, I'm also not afraid of nuclear war, but bringing up the North Korean issue to the table, I'm not sure, well, I already discussed whether Russia influences North Korea. I think that it's a very indirect influence in the way that Russia showed North Korea a very inspiring example of like a very effective nuclear coercive behavior, how you can do what you want to do in the region, just covering with the nuclear umbrella of your nuclear deterrence in this way. And so North Korea now is trying to probe this experience, as I believe. But as for the possibility of nuclear war, recently I've heard the presentations of my colleagues in the CNS, and they say the interesting thing that, for example, now, if the United States would like to deploy nuclear weapons against North Korea, so anyway, those ICBMs will have to fly over the territory of Russia. And in any way, Russia's early warning system will react as if nuclear weapons, ICBMs of the United States are flying at their territory because they want, like us. And the level, or the current level of trust between Russia and the United States today is so low that no one believes that, we are just trying to hit North Korea. And the other point is that even if not ICBMs, but just if to deploy this ballistic missile defense, anyway, if the current deployment, consider the current deployment of missile defense, so if, for example, some kind of ICBM is going from North Korea and the United States are trying to hit it, it again flies into the radar's territory of Russian radars, and it's perceived as the ballistic missile incoming from the United States over the territory of Russia. So in this case, North Korea can become the very indirect reason of this unexpected and unintentional start of the nuclear war.
Well, that's cheery.
Yes.
Be afraid.
Yeah, good. Yeah.
Yeah. Josh, I wanted to try to maybe answer your question whether Trump has made a difference. Yes. The point is that the fact...
But just to clarify, I know Trump has made a difference. Trump has made a difference in the trajectory of U.S.-Russian relations. It's a more focused.
What I'm trying to say is that imagine... Okay, anyway, this year has finally convinced, deprived the Russian leadership of any last hope that they had. Because a year ago, so if I use the Russian expression, it's the last nail into the coffin's lid of the Russian-Western pragmatic transactional relations. Because let's imagine it would be Clinton, and the relationship would be bad. And everybody would be saying, yes, this is exactly what we expected. At some point, there will be a different president who's going to fix it. Now, you've got this different president who publicly has been arguing, still is arguing, that Russian-American relationship has to be fixed, and is not doing anything about it. Because he's not able, or because he's not willing if we apply conspiracy theory. But the point is, nothing gets improved. And that means that you really have to say goodbye to all your hopes. Because if he cannot fix it, nobody's going to fix it. And if nobody's going to fix it, why would Kremlin have to care about some kind of promoting any kind of positive transactional agenda? it has to be preparing for war. And this is what it is doing. Not necessarily a hot war, but a very long confrontational relationship. And in that sense, anyway, that's how I view it.
Yeah.
That's a pessimistic view.
I want to quickly respond to that. One thing is, Adam Mirowitz and I have a formal model which we use to think about protesters in new democracies and whether protests would keep protesting if you protest, overthrow the regime, and then get a bad leader. And I've never thought about that model as being applicable in this kind of flipped way, but it's the same sort of argument. As long as you think there's a potential to get a better, in our story it was a better leader, a higher quality leader, you might continue to come out on the street, but you get enough draws from the distribution and you see they're all low quality leaders. It wasn't about changing the regime. And it's kind of apropos that, which is interesting. So I'll show you that paper. But I do want to push back on one question on that, which is that Trump was close to taking the sanctions off, right? What prevented that? What prevented that was that the Russians, if we, again, positing everything that we do and do not know, got caught. Now, if you believe it's a total conspiracy, if you believe it's completely fabricated and there was no activity on the part of the GRU or any of these organizations, and this has completely been made up by the US deep state to justify going after Russia, then fine, I buy your story. But if not, if you think that there were even, we can call them rogue elements, or we can call them, we can go back to talk about other myths, right? That Russia's a monolithic set of power where Putin says something and everything happens. No, there's lots of stuff going on. But if you believe any of this stuff, then doesn't it stand to reason that there could have been a US president who wanted to have better relations with Russia, and that president could have very well improved US relations with Russia if the Russians hadn't got caught with, to throw another US expression out there, with their hand in the cookie jar, right, to the point where they compromised him, to the extent where it became such a liability for his own party that his own party, couldn't go along with that. Couldn't that be an alternative interpretation that would then give a different spin on this, that it's not so much that there was no chance this could ever happen, it's that it was incompetently executed by the Russians themselves by getting in this position where they took the leader who was most sympathetic to them and put him in a situation where it was much harder for him to do. I mean, now this then leads a prior question of why on earth Trump was so pro-Russia to start with, and whether that was because he was enlightened and because he realized that we had to do this, or there were other reasons why this, of all things, was motivating Trump, during the course of his election. So
There can be a different argument. Let's show his opponents that we can be nasty. So they will understand that we can be really nasty, and that's why they will be listening to his argument that the United States should be interested in improving the relations with the United States.
Can I just also one sentence to kind of maybe also push back on your argument? There are maybe no more hope for the Russian side to have a more kind of friendly US president, but I think there are hope for Europe. There are hope in Russia for Europe to change its position. And that's going back to what I think Kurilla was the right point about. There are, in time and space, there are issues that will be overshadowing what is happening in Russia. And I think it depends how Syria evolves. If Syria deteriorates a lot, then it becomes such an issue for Europe. Then the problems with Russia and Ukraine are kind of on the side. And if a solution is found in Syria with a certain role for Russia, it will also push a lot of European leaders to kind of calm down things with Russia. And I think the Kremlin is hoping for that. I think the Kremlin is hoping for...
I disagree.
I don't think Syria can deteriorate to such a degree that it will become such a massive problem to Europe. Look at Libya.
Exactly.
It has deteriorated a lot, and so what?
No, I mean, we had this story exactly a year ago, when throughout the fall, for 3 months, European leaders were during the bombing of Aleppo, they were constantly discussing whether and how to react. And the response was zero, nil. They couldn't agree about anything. As compared with Ukrainian situation, where they agreed about sanctions and they stick to it whether they like it or not. They were not able to take any decision, even kind of verbal condemnation was not done properly within the EU context. They can't do it.
I mean, I guess I don't think Syria is something which is relevant. But on your point about with the hand in the cookie jar, Arkady was saying about the Russian perspective.
Yeah.
And what you are saying implies that Russian would accept the fact that it's their own fault and they were caught. It's our, and that's
Is
impossible.
there any evidence that would convince the Russian public that in fact this happened?
I don't think it's about the public.
Yes.
You know, with Russian public, I don't think it really matters.
But if it's not about the public, then
Important question.
yeah.
Is there any evidence?
Kim, you can't imagine these evidences, and Putin is perfectly right when saying that, well, show us the facts. Do you have scripts of these GRU orders? It's impossible. There can be no evidences anytime.
That lead to pretty close to it. Yes, close.
No,
If you go to the CrowdStrike website, they go in great detail through all the evidence they have and then all of the things that might come up against that evidence and why they nonetheless believe that the evidence is correct. And I have not seen a single report by any technical person, either Russian or American or anyone else, who goes point by point down the CrowdStrike thing and says CrowdStrike is wrong. Instead, let me just say this. Instead, I mean, there's the one guy who said that something about the timing of it, but that wasn't going point by point down the CrowdStrike thing. Instead, what we have is FireEye, which is a CrowdStrike competitor, which has a very strong incentive to say CrowdStrike's an idiot, come to us instead for your cybersecurity. To go point by point down what CrowdStrike did and say, yes, we agree.
Kim, you did already contribute a lot to growing Putin's popularity when blaming Russia for deciding the fate of American elections.
It's a very different question. And I'm asking a serious question.
Then Russians
and for
will be
people
proud.
who do not feel obligated to say something, but who are genuinely open to this question, my question is there any evidence that could convince, let's say if something is found in the future, is there any evidence that could convince reasonable people in Russia that Russia actually did do the hacking and interfere in the election?
It would
Or
demonstrate
is any,
that Russia
let
is
me
very
finish
powerful
my
and so on.
question. Or is any evidence that is presented going to be denied because of course Russia couldn't do this?
No, we'll take these evidences.
But at the contrary, Kim, that's exactly what Kurilla said. It will make people proud to think that Russia has been able to do that, because what you would need to deconstruct is to deconstruct the idea that US is not doing the same on the Russian side. So the Russian perception was like, good, we did it because they are spending the last 20 years to do it to us. So that's not the problem.
But just to make my point, if there is a belief that Russia could do this and did do this, then the next step is, if they were going to win the Trump was going to win the election anyway without Russia having done this, right? Then the fact that Russia went and did this is probably actually the reason that the sanctions got strengthened, right? And that clearly reasonable Russians, I think, can see that this has become very toxic in American politics, especially if you want to not blame Trump and you say this. Anyway, so we have a bunch of other hands. We can keep going on this. We can talk more about this over dinner. Yvonne, did you want to?
Yeah, well,
actually the very last exchange was about what I wanted to say. That is actually that the whole discourse is empowering Putin. Yeah, of the whole discourse that Putin could influence American elections is something that empowers Putin and makes him much more influential in the eyes of the Russian public. So it's something which, yeah, and well, it's already has been said, and continue what Arkady was just said. Just to mirror very popular American statement that there is a. What we got is that Russia had not a Clinton problem, but American problem. It's a problem not in a particular politician, but America as a whole. And this is it's a changing situation. While I'm more optimistic in the long run as a historian, like several decades from now will be different.
Especially
but,
centuries.
for centuries, yeah. But for the medium range story, it will be better. And of course, and all of this heated exchange which Kim started, it's actually made a bigger. you know, on the Russian side, it's empower also this whataboutism, and you know, it's what actually Marlene answered. Whataboutism, because one of the answers from the Russian public, educated Russian public, was you Americans did the same for us for many years, and this is very hard to answer, because it's something which empowers this argument of whataboutism. Why you Americans are getting so much, you know, problem about that, because you did for us and for everybody else the same thing, and this is very hard this is not an argument that we did not, it's an argument that, yeah, we did the same that you did for us.
Can I just, just very,
we want to.
A Russian colleague was telling me there was no evidence of this having happened. And I showed the website on CrowdStrike that went through point by point by point, and she had gone on and on and on about there's no evidence of this happening. When she saw the website, she said, well, you know those technical people, they can get people to believe anything.
It's like O.J. Simpson trial, do you remember? It's O.J. Simpson, you know, those people who believes in the test, genetic test, and those who don't. That's it.
Yeah.
You cannot convince them.
The first speaker spoke about this concept of a stagnation, you know, for a long period of time between U.S. and Russian relations, and it's hard to see where the miasma ends. But couldn't it be the case that what's really going on is that Russia and most of the world is seeing the United States as a deteriorating power? That it's no longer the superpower, China's becoming the superpower. The United States is falling into kind of an internal, I won't equate it with the Roman Republic, but internal faction fights, so that it doesn't really matter to them whether you're really on the Democratic side or the Republican side. What matters to them is that the United States is almost by its own volition internally destabilizing itself. So therefore, if you're trying to then construct a foreign policy, the foreign policy you're going to orient to is where you see the future is. And the future is clearly going to be in Asia. It's going to be how Russia deals with China, and both the opportunities and the threats of China to Russia, and also to see the world in a dichotomous relationship between the United States and Russia, and sort of screw all the Americans who think they're important by blabbing on about John McCain and sanctions and who stole the election. And so what that means is that you then put Europe into play, and primarily Germany into play. And it's very interesting that the Russians didn't, there's no accusation of the Russians trying to quote unquote destabilize the German government, because the German government's very important to them, and German industry is very important to them. So what I think is happening is that America is becoming more and more irrelevant, except to Americans who think that America can just it's this like Punch and Judy show with the Americans. But what the Russians and other people are looking at is the whole Eurasian developments in the third world and things like that. So that's where I kind of think it's happening. I don't think it's going to be just a stagnation. I think at least the image, until the United States reverses this, is that America is in decline.
Henry, do you want to?
Let's get a few more.
Okay,
and then
all right,
I can
yes.
respond. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. The question was, could U.S.-Russia relations get worse in regards to Syria? I think we should generalize it to the Middle East altogether. And interestingly enough, nobody mentioned the fact that the relation between Saudi Arabia and Iran has got worse in the last 2-3 days, actually.
Yeah.
To the point where Iran is now threatening Saudi Arabia directly and vice versa. When you think that the United States now supports Saudi Arabia to some extent, and Russia supports Iran to the other extent, the possibility of a general complication in the Middle East has got much worse. So that's regarding the Middle East, and nobody has mentioned this thing yet. Secondly, regarding North Korea, Putin would like to appear in his meeting with Trump in a few days that he's the necessary interlocutor in terms of solving the North Korean problem. The problem is Russia doesn't have any levers to influence North Korea. It used to have lots of levers until the Soviet Union collapsed, when there was no relation with China on the one hand, and Russia was the main supplier of equipment, economic aid, and technology to North Korea. Right now, Russia's relation with North Korea, in terms of economic relationship, technology transfer, except for some smuggling of weapon technology, are essentially non-existent. So Putin's levels to actually affect anything happening in North Korea are very small. On the other end, most of the levers are in China's hands. And China, for their own reasons, doesn't want to use the levers that it has. On the other hand, the United States is constrained in any relation with North Korea, among many other factors, by the mere factor there is a border between North Korea and Russia. And that's a constraining factor.
Thank you. Yes?
The gentleman made my point on Iran, but also looking at another potential conflict. There's a stronger relationship between Trump and Israel. And Israel is getting very nervous about Hezbollah and the Iranians getting closer to their border. That is another potential conflict. And there's a question of Israel sends missiles, attacks Syria, what would Russia's response be? And the question on both these Iranian and Israeli Syrian questions are, could both of those major powers restrain those countries, or if they do start fighting, do we get involved?
So we're gonna keep, we're gonna keep thinking. Yeah.
We had no time, of course, for the Middle East, so I apologize. But a very valid question to ask. One of the Iran, in fact, why the U.S. is relevant to Syria? One of the three reasons why it's really, in a very concrete sense, it's very highly relevant to Syria is the Iran factor. Not just because of the U.S., but it's a common position shared by U.S., Israel, Saudi Arabia, but also genuinely by most Syrian opposition groups, including ceasefire groups present in Astana. That for them, they're fine going to Astana, even despite the fact that it's brokered by Iran. But what they cannot accept, all of them, is Iran's status as a guarantor with military presence on the ground in Syria. Now, one of the more realistic in the long-term demands of the Syrian opposition and also of Israel is that actually Hezbollah and Shia militias, foreign Shia militias, leave Syria, which is one of the conditions for the deal. And that's going to happen, okay? But for that to happen, you need three conditions to be met. Because Iran is as much concerned about any U.S. presence on the ground in Syria as the U.S., Israel, and others are concerned about Iranian presence. Yeah? So you need three conditions. First, you need end of major fighting in Syria, which would make Iranian and pro-Iranian militias role on the ground less needed, you know. Second, you need to Iran's influence in Syria beyond and apart from direct military presence needs to be somehow secured. They need to be assured that they keep enough influence even without Hezbollah, Shia militias, and even Iranian direct presence. And third, any such withdrawal should not look as a victory. It's very important to make it not look as a victory, outright victory for Israel and the United States. Which is one of the reasons people were so pessimistic about, there's nothing we can cooperate on. You know, there are issues. Russia has found a very elegant solution to this entire controversy regarding Hezbollah. It has been closing eyes on Hezbollah, on Israel attacks on Hezbollah forces in Syria. It has just agreed with Israel to extend the buffer zone in Syria, free from Hezbollah on the border with Israel. But it gets nervous when Israel hits occasionally Syrian government forces. And there are other leverage, you know. Even I would go as far as saying that, you know, even a perception, an illusion, not a reality, but an illusion of any one of the importance of continuing dialogue between Russia and the United States on Syria is that even an illusion of a potential backdoor deal behind Iran's back becomes a leverage on Iran. So in real world, when I'm listening to all this pessimism, it's really when we get to practical conflict management, Afghanistan, Syria, other places, you know, there's so much going on in real life that actually contradicts many of this rhetoric and so on. And consultations do go on, and multiple tracks, and things are being solved. And so I'm slightly more optimistic when it comes to practical problems, especially beyond post-Soviet Eurasia or U.S. domestic politics.
Okay. Alexa?
It's partly in response to your question, partly in response to...
Do you want to, can you introduce yourself?
I was trying to summarize. I mean, there is no uniformity, of course. Just kind of get someone have a very rough summary of what the Russian view would be on U.S.-Russian relationship 1 year after Trump. So people kind of correctly said that kind of had Clinton been elected, they knew the relations would have been in bad situation, and then you would have been sitting in this room discussing how we can possibly improve it, but they would have turned bad in a predictable way. So Clinton was a kind of a known thing. Trump was not as much euphoria about him, but he was a wild card. It's clear that he would have changed the rules of the game, but in a kind of unpredictable and risky thing. But nobody could predict in which way kind of the rules of the game would change. And sort of, and that sounds a year after, sort of, it's sort of possible to see how the rules of the game have changed. And in this sense, I'm actually not sharing the optimism. But saying that kind of one possible Russian view is that the Trump election had put U.S. political establishment in a dysfunctional state, in a state of irrational paranoia and using Russia as a boogeyman. And as long as the U.S. political establishment continues in this state, no meaningful discussion, settlement agreements are possible. They would make some gestures. They would say, yes, we would want to cooperate here, there. We'd like to try to come to terms. But essentially, it's not that U.S. is not treated seriously in a long-term decline, but in a short term, it becomes such an irrational, dysfunctional state that it cannot be a negotiable partner. No possible agreements would be trusted. And in this sense, kind of their possible attitude is just to sit and wait. So if the U.S. managed to solve its own problem, the internal political one, and get into a saner state, then kind of a different sunset page would be open. So they still prefer better relations to U.S. and they don't underestimate the United States in the sense, and it's not that they're casting the lot with China. It just kind of, but temporarily, and if I don't think there is much hope at the moment that any kind of irrational attitude or so anything that Russia could possibly do in education is not going to help. That's it. So until the U.S. political establishment kind of fought its own battle, kind of and itself.
I would just say that in that context, you can still do a lot of very practical things, such as negotiations on Afghanistan, certain deals with, with Israel and Hezbollah and things like that. That it's actually a very sort of pragmatic, very obvious mutual self-interest policy, but the grand strategy is, you can have a grand strategy if one player can't get its act together.
Artemy, can you introduce yourself as well?
Yes, my name is Artemy Troitsky. I'm a journalist and writer, not really an academic. But I may be considered nearly a local guy because I'm partly based in Moscow. So I would like to say a few words on the unanswered question about Russian youth. Well, I think Alexandra asked me about that. So the case with Russian youth at the moment is that for quite a long time it's wallowing in a deeply rooted schizophrenia. The impact of American soft power on Russian people and Russian youth in particular is very underestimated. In Russian movie theaters, you have 90% Hollywood movies. The most popular TV series, again, are the Game of Thrones, House of Cards, and so on. Hugely popular. If we talk about music, it's even a worse case because like you've seen a patriotic Russian singer named Gleb Kornilov, right? So first he was wearing a Diesel t-shirt. Second, he was playing a Fender Stratocaster guitar. Third, his whole song was a spoof of American rock songs, you know, with all the riffs stolen from those songs. So I think that Russian youth is not hopeless at all. The new uprising of Russian teenagers in 2017 is a very good sign of the fact that the new generation is utterly different from the old generation. I think that the generation of the notice was completely lost. I mean, the most talentless and stupid and conformist generation of all I've seen, and I've been there. Well, I'm 62, so I knew the generations for many decades. So the brand new one is quite promising, and of course it needs further research, and I think that academics and scholars, you know, should really get down to it, because, like, I spoke with people from Levada Center who've made a survey with Timothy, and asked them this in April, and my question was, could you predict that something like this, something of the kind what happened on March 26th would happen? And they said no. We had absolutely no evidence, no facts, no suggestions that things like this might happen. We are as surprised as anyone else. So it's an interesting topic. And finally, I would like to just share a couple of very obvious observations on the main theme of the conference today, which is U.S.-Russian relations 1 year after. So on the Russian side, I can say that despite America is as demonized by Russia in the mass media as before, the attitude towards Mr. Trump in particular is still very soft, very tolerable. I mean, they can say awful things about America, about NATO, this and that, but they never touch Mr. Trump. I mean, Trump is now, I think he's like the avatar of Mr. Putin in Russia. It's on the Russian side. On the American side, of course, the obvious thing is that Russia is again, for the first time since perestroika, is on the map of American mass media. And I do take Ivan's explanation that this is happening because, America faces its own problems and sees Russia as a scapegoat. But I would say that the reason is not only this, but also the fact that America probably intuitively feels that a lot of things and issues very typical for Russia are now starting to happen in America full scale, like political incompetence, corruption, amount of lies and hypocrisy in the mass media, and general awfulness of a scapegoat now becomes America's very own thing. And maybe, therefore, America is putting much more attention to Russia as a blueprint of what might expect America in the foreseeable future.
Thank you. Thanks. Yeah, Misha.
I just think, when we think about what could a conference look at when it's 2 years after, or 3 years after, or 4 years after, what kind of things that we haven't looked at and might be worth thinking about. The value of the discussions like that, maybe they flesh out what was left out. And one of the things that I thought about was that there is a constant in this first year. Trump remains the negative, the nagging bob of negativism, characterizing other people, especially in tweets. And yet he has never criticized Putin yet. In not a single time, I don't think. He remains that kind of, So what is then, the larger question, what is then the source of Trump's motivation toward Russia? Is it civilizational? Is it geopolitical? Is it personal, financial? These, I think, would be something that maybe we will, as we discover more of it, maybe we will be able to understand the continuity and change forces a bit better.
Yeah. I guess one of my challenges here and the dilemmas I see is that, and echoed, I think, with a number of comments, and I think Kim and Katerina mentioned it, is that I think the opportunities that exist for cooperation are really about damage limiting, conflict avoidance, or nuanced diplomacy at best. In the U.S. now we have institutional constraints on the executive, and so our policies are going to, our signaling is going to have to be very nuanced and almost by omission, by not enforcing sanctions, by not doing certain things. The problem is that that's occurring at a time where in our domestic politics, that those nuances get lost in the nature of the types of problems we have. And so that's the dilemma to me. But the reason why I guess I'm not overly pessimistic is that the current agenda, it seems that ultimately our strategic interests are still asymmetrical. Where it really matters to the Russians, it doesn't as matter, even though we bark, our bite is not so great. We don't have an interest in pushing forward. We may not have a clear strategy as well, as somebody mentioned. But as long as those interests remain asymmetrical, I think there's the hope is that we can get out of this period domestically. But the risk, of course, is that those interests become, something else happens, North Korea or something like that. But in those cases, our interests may actually become symmetrical, and we may be able to deal with those problems. But the problem, I think, is that the current agenda is littered by asymmetries, and the opportunities for pragmatic diplomacy require nuance that our domestic situation does not allow. And so if we, the hope is that our domestic situations are going to change, either both with the Russian election and then the midterm elections and whatever happens with these investigations. But there's probably a hope that we can hold the fort. This is, of course, a very suboptimal outcome that I was mentioning, but in terms of the apocalyptic nature, I think that I'm a little less fearful of that. The other reason why is I think the leaderships generally are opportunistic, not risk-taking. And so changing this situation is going to require some major exogenous shock that could converge our interests internationally and hopefully domestically with those changes.
Arkady, you had a hand up before. Did you want to? No? Okay. All right. So let me turn it back over to my panelists to wrap up.
Yeah, so maybe we could just wrap up. Yeah, I mean, I don't have any grand concluding comments, but I mean, I guess I would just interject that, there's a lot of research on beliefs, right, belief formation, and one of the findings is they're highly resistant to facts. We all think of ourselves as rational, but in fact, kind of the way the brain works is, you have lots of considerations in mind, and we're highly susceptible to being cued at certain moments by certain considerations that happen to be in the air, and kind of beliefs form based on kind of emotions that form very early on in the process that make kind of cue certain beliefs or kind of activate certain beliefs that make it very hard for beliefs to change. And there's even some research that finds that people motivated to find facts, right, motivated to determine accuracy and to think deeply about it, in fact wind up accessing their own prior views because those somehow feel more comfortable or true, and that the best way to kind of counteract, to sort of counteract this is, it's when somebody you don't expect to have a particular view, or you expect to have an interest against advocating that view, in fact, advocates it. So, I think that's one reason why we see the shift, towards Russia, right, among Republicans, is partly because they were totally not expected to do so, but then you suddenly have Republican leaders saying, okay, it's all right. And so I think that's a more powerful cue, and you see the opposite thing happening among the Democrats. And I just kind of coming back to one of Josh's points, I mean, I guess I don't think Putin will be too disillusioned about what happened, in the sense that what the election showed was that Russia is not a deal breaker for electing a president, right? A pro-Russian policy, you can still get elected, whether or not they did it, but it was close enough that they could make a difference. You know, whatever it was, Americans were susceptible enough to buy this stuff that was kind of put out there for them. And after Trump was elected, right, you saw a surge, you know, or a significant leap in pro-American sentiments in Russia, you know, at least initially, you know, which is also interesting. And so, you know, that actually lends, you know, kind of gives me some cause for optimism as well. You know, not there's so much we can do about it, but, you know, I wouldn't rule out that there could be, you know, kind of as a new unpredictable move by, you know, the regime, by Putin to try and, you know, freshen up or come up with something different, you know, some sort of, you know, more pro-Western turn in the future, just to liven things up, because I think there would be a resonance that could be generated among the Russian population that you'd see, right? You know, just as you could generate anti-Americanism, I think it could go in the other direction more than people often think it could. Again, I wouldn't predict that as being likely, but I think there are these possibilities for improvement. So maybe I'll just leave it there.
I won't say anything.
All right, I'm gonna make a couple. I want to make a couple comments, and as one of the people in PONARS who primarily does mass political behavior, I want to make just a few comments about on that aspect of things. So take the Russia hat off and put the political science, mass political behavior hat on. First thing is, and Henry's things about the facts and people's problems with facts. I want to just add a couple more things to this. But yes, this is a huge problem, and this is for. I work on social media and politics, and so I'm involved in 7,000 conversations right now in conferences about disinformation and disinformation spread online. And there is a real issue here with the sort of gut reaction of experts is, oh, if something's wrong, tell people the truth. And there's been a lot of really good research that's done in political science about coming out now about just how hard it is to correct people's misinformation on facts. And it actually, in some ways, it's worse than Henry said, because if you tell people an opinion that they heard something, you tell them that no, here's the evidence that's actually incorrect. If the original opinion goes with their partisan persuasion, it turns out that the fact-checking, giving them the facts, can actually make them believe the first thing even more than they did previously, because what it serves to do is remind them about the thing that they heard previously that already accorded with their views and the emphasis. But two interesting things about this, I will say. Like one, in addition to Henry's thing about this coming from a source you don't expect it to come from, two other things. One place where we often see this is asking people about the state of the economy. You ask a bunch of Democrats about the economy right now, they'll tell you it's terrible. You ask a bunch of Republicans about the economy, they'll tell you it's fantastic. But it turns out there's some new work, which is, I know people have some questions about it, but there's some new work out there showing that actually if you pay people to give you the right answer, they'll give you the right answer. So when you monetarize incentive people and say, instead of just saying, is unemployment too high, and then oh, it's high. If you say, I'll give you $1 if you tell me what the unemployment rate is, people get remarkably more accurate about this. The second thing is, so that's an interesting development, which is an optimistic thing on this, oh, people don't know these things. The second thing is that when Henry said this thing about coming from an unexpected source, another thing, there's been some really interesting research by Brendan Nyhan, among others, but also the research by Adam Berinsky, Jason Reifler, finding that if you give people, when correcting facts, if you give people an alternative explanation for something, that actually helps as well. So to just say, like, there's a politician who, a rumor comes out that the politician resigned because they were caught in an affair. And if you just say, no, they didn't actually have an affair, it's been found out that that original story was wrong, that doesn't do nearly as good as updating people as when you tell them, actually what ended up happening was they got caught taking a bribe and they had to resign because there was a corruption scandal. Then they'll update off of no longer thinking that they had an affair. So that's kind of an interesting finding as well, too. Second thing, on Kolya's point, originally about like public opinion being a barrier to this, public opinion is always remarkably malleable. There's a whole sort of theory of public opinion that's still, all these days, after 3 decades, sort of the dominant theory of public opinion in political science, which is that public opinion is, most people don't have fixed issues fixed opinions on lots of political issues that we as experts think about all the time. And you can theorize about the answers people will give to survey questions that has to do with the last thing they've heard and how it conforms with prior beliefs and things like that. And I have been, as someone who buys into this, I've still been stunned about how malleable public opinion has turned out to be in the aftermath of these elections. And if I'd known we were going to get to this, I'd show you slides right now. But like Republicans changing their views on free trade, Free trade was like a cornerstone of what it meant to be a Republican for decades. And then, wham, Trump gets elected, and all of a sudden, majorities of Republicans are against free trade, which makes you wonder whether people even had an opinion on free trade to start with. Democrats, wham, the election happens, all of a sudden, Democrats love the CIA. Right? Because the CIA, I mean, and like, this is, you know, you go back to the 70s and tell my parents this, they'd have, you know, they have a heart attack about this. But like, so it's incredible how much people change and how much they cue off of things. So on the one hand, it's a bigger problem than you think, because people's opinions are so malleable. But on the other hand, this story that like, anti-Russian sentiment is, in the public, is a block towards elites changing their behavior, I think is overstated. Somebody said something about, Adam, you were saying, like, we need, you know, what we really need is nuances. Like, there's never been a situation where the public understood nuances in politics.
I'm talking about strategic bargaining.
Yeah. So this is an elite level story. Like, I think nuances always get lost. And then one final thing, because it's underlined a lot of the discussion here, and especially the sort of discussion we've had right now about, okay, so did the Russians, you know, what is the consequences of thinking the Russians influenced the outcome of the election? What is the beliefs about whether the Russians influenced the outcome of the election? What does this mean from a US perspective? What does it mean from there? As someone who works with, you know, who works in the quantitative analysis field, one way of looking at this election is that it was so close that anything and everything could have influenced the outcome of this election, right? That this is a really hard election to ever say what influenced it, because from a statistical sense, it was a coin flip. And if we ran the election 100 times, Hillary probably would have won 40 of those times, and Trump probably would have won 60 of those times. Or maybe the statistical models we had the first time were actually right, and Trump would have won 30 of those times, and Hillary would have won 70, but we got the draw. You keep doing these things, eventually you get the draws from this. But like, we can pin causal influence on the weather. I'm sure we can run models that show if the weather was different, the outcome would have been different. I've seen stuff on the Comey letter, right? Like, if Comey doesn't release the letter, things are differences. So anything that we're going to talk about, this question of whatever, and we can take the word Russian interference out of it, whether the doxing of Podesta's emails influenced the outcome of the election, did they cause Trump to win? Sure, because everything, when it's this close, everything can have that tiny little marginal effect. And we won't be able to rule out that things didn't have that marginal effect, and we won't be able to rule in that they did. But that's just good. There's a statistical problem to this. And so I agree with Misha's point that we will know more a year from now. We will continue to know more about interesting relationships surrounding this. To me, the biggest question is, how on earth are you the insurgent candidate who is upending the party's positions on free trade, on immigration, on all these nationalist elements, and you show up at the Republican convention and you have one thing you want to change in the platform, and it's about immigration. No, it's about the wall. No. It's you want to change the position on Ukraine sanctions. That made no sense at the time. It continues to make no sense. We will have more answers on that, I think.
It continues to make more and more sense.
Yeah, it continues to make more and more sense. I'm sure we'll have more answers on this. But don't hold your breath on ever getting a definitive answer about whether anything turned to influence the outcome of this election, because it was really close, and it's going to be really hard, I think, in that framework, because we're not going to be able to falsify that anything didn't impact the outcome of the election, right? So anyway, so those are just a few sort of political sciencey comments on it. At this point, I think it's 6:30. I think that gives the members of the PONARS seminar, the members of the PONARS group who have come here who are joining us for dinner, just enough time if you want to go back to your hotel and drop stuff off and meet us for dinner at 7 o'clock. It may not give you enough time. You can also head directly to the restaurant from a logistical standpoint. And it gives me an opportunity to thank everybody for coming out today. Thanks once again to Henry and Marlene. Thanks so much to Heather. Thanks all of you for coming.